Hello and welcome back to All for Women's Football. Today we are joined by a special guest and someone you may well recognise in Nancy Gillen. She's the author of a new book, La Vie Jamais Racontée, about Alice Milliat, who was a pioneer in women's sport in France, orchestrating 4 editions of the Women's World Games and establishing a French football team that toured the UK. I can't wait to hear all about it, so let's get into it. Nancy, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's great to have you. I'm very excited as a bit of a history nerd to talk all about women's sport history.
Well, thanks for having me. I mean, I'm also a history nerd, so I think any chance to combine women's sports and history and just talk about it for a little bit, I'm very willing to do.
Brilliant. Yeah, so let's get into it. And I think my first question is just like, let's start from the start. Where did the idea for the book come about, and kind of how did you get involved, etc.?
Yeah, so I had the first idea came into my mind about 2019, which is 5 years ago. It's quite a long time ago now. But I was working at Inside the Games, which is an Olympic news website, and one of my colleagues wrote a blog post about Alice. It wasn't like the longest. It was probably like 1,000 words or so, but I read it and I was just astonished that I'd never heard of her before. As someone who loves women's sport, has been really passionate about it, someone that achieved so much and did so much work, the fact that I'd literally never heard of her just really surprised me. And I just kind of had in my head, oh, this would be a great idea for a book. But I mean, at the time I was like a bit younger. I graduated in 2018, so it was only kind of a year out of uni. It was a bit too, I don't know, overwhelming, daunting a task. And then, a couple of years down the line, with the Paris Olympics coming up, which is going to be the first Olympics with a gender equal like playing field, like 50-50 male, female athletes. And then Alice is from France. The Olympics are in France. It seemed too good a chance to miss to put a book out about her in the run up to those games. I think it must have been 2022 I started like researching how to write a book and then putting together proposals, sending it to publishers. I was really happy to get pitch publishers. They're quite well respected within the sport book industry. And then last year, towards the end of last year, after the Women's World Cup, I spent 4 months just writing it pretty much every day. So it's amazing to kind of have that journey back in 2019 and fast forward 5 years, and now the book is actually a real life physical copy, which is crazy.
I just wanted to throw in a question, actually. I've literally just thought of, as you were saying, and briefly, we very briefly touched on this backstage in terms of what the reception's been like. I was going to ask this towards the end, but while you were talking about kind of what got you into writing the book, like what has the overall reception been? Obviously, I know it's not been out for too long yet, but have you had good feedback, solid feedback from it so far?
Yeah, really solid. And I think when I was telling people that I was writing it, people within women's sports were either like had heard of Alice and were like, "Oh, that's amazing," because I felt the same in terms of not enough people know about her. So I'm really glad someone's kind of writing a book and shining a light on her. Or people were like, "Oh, I'd never heard of her, but that sounds like really, really interesting and something I want to read." So even before it had been published, like the feedback and the kind of consensus was really positive, which was great. And then since then, like you said, it's came out on Monday, and I think people were receiving it. Seems like a lot of people received it today. But everyone seems to be really interested in it, and hopefully it's kind of weird because you write it and it's quite abstract, and then you don't really think about people reading it and kind of judging it by whether it's good. But hopefully people find it interesting, if anything, and like learn a little bit more about women's sport and the history of it by reading the book.
I thought as you said that we were all going to like hold our copy up when you said everyone had received it today. I thought we were all going to like do a little
reveal.
Sorry, Laura, carry on. I don't know why that just go into my head when you said that.
Sorry.
You're on mute, Laura.
Thank you. Well, I guess, I mean, NT's kind of asked for it here, but we're just to give us a bit about Alice Milliat and a quick summary. We'll obviously go into a little bit deeper throughout the show, but just a little quick summary of who she was to kick us off.
Yeah, so she was born in the late 19th century, so I think it was 1883 or 4. I should know that off by heart by now. But so it was was like in her 30s, 40s, 50s in the early 20th century. She initially was a rower, but not at a very high level, but she did kind of participate in sport. And she eventually entered sports administration in France and basically just rose to the very top. And I think to have a woman in sports administration in those days was really rare. But she was president of a women's sport club in Paris. And she felt very strongly about the inclusion of women's athletics at the Olympics. So she eventually became head of this kind of umbrella group of women's sports clubs in France. And from that position campaigned for women's athletics at the Olympics. That was rejected. And so she was like, right, well, I'm going to make my own women's sports federation, which she did. And then when women continued to not be included at the Olympic Games, she created her own editions of the Women's Olympics, which were initially called the Women's Olympics, but then the Olympic Committee had a massive issue with that. So it was rebranded to the Women's World Games. But that just gave female athletes an opportunity to compete really at a really high level against other countries in front of thousands of spectators, which was really rare those days. And then she was also involved in other sports such as football, which I'm sure we'll get into more, but she created her own French women's football team essentially, which came and toured in England and played Dick Kerr Ladies. And then Dick Kerr Ladies went on a tour in France and played the French women's football team. So yeah, she kind of had involvement in a lot of different things. If there was anything happening in women's sport in like the 1920s and 30s, Alice was probably involved. And then I won't spoil it too much, but essentially the end of her career, I think sport was completely dominated by men, and they saw her as a massive threat to her authority. So they basically manipulated her out of the scene and sidelined her essentially. And I think part of the reason why people don't really know about her today is because she kind of just went. It wasn't like she kept working until she hit retirement age and then retired. She just decided to kind of stop, and no one really spoke about her again, which is why I think people don't really know about her now. But yeah, she did a lot. She did a whole book's worth. So
Absolutely, what you just said at the end there kind of ties nicely into the next question in terms of, to date there's not a lot of, I remember when we were putting this channel together, we one of the things that Laura particularly was talking about was wanting to talk about the history of women's football and bringing that to the forefront, because at the moment there's the lack of stories that, as you just mentioned there, it's not heavily reported or published these days. From a broader sense, why do you think it's important that we get these stories out there and heard, whether that's in written format as you've done on, in terms of the book, and now us talking about on these kinds of shows as well?
Yeah, I think it's just an acknowledgement, really. Like, I think it's really easy for us these days to be like, oh, look at these thousands of people that are coming to women's football, and people are interested in it now. And I know it's not perfect, and we've seen with the stuff going on in the championship, we've got a really long way to go. But I think it's just really important that we just don't forget people that put in such hard work. And I think these days it's easier to be an advocate for women's sport and to promote it. I think it's something that majority of people are up for. But back in the early 20th century, what Alice was doing was just completely unprecedented and trailblazing. And I think it's just a real shame if her work never gets acknowledged. And it's not even her either. So a lot of the book touches on some of the female athletes who were given the chance to compete in, whether it was Women's World Games, whether it was some of the French football players, and they've all got incredible stories as well. And I think when you look at men's sport, or just sport really, there's so many books, so many documentaries. Like, we could all name all these either male figures in sport or male athletes who did incredible things, but it's a lot harder to do for female athletes. And I think just to know and acknowledge the work that's come beforehand, and it's such a shame they didn't get the credit when they were alive, but I think the least we can do is try and do that now, give that to them now. So yeah, I think it's just super, super important.
Yeah, and I guess it's kind of a question on a similar vein. I got given a few books recently, right, for this like prize, and they were all men's, like you say, like the nichest people, like the Newcastle physio from the 1990s, and I'm like, it's cool, but like, why do we need this when there's like this whole century of women's sport that we just not like heard about? So pleased to receive this book. I guess the next was slightly niche, and I'd be just interested to hear your perspective on it. Is that I think we are starting to hear. You spoke about Dick Kerr ladies. There's a podcast recently on the Colville Munitions girls, kind of on BBC Sounds, that was really interesting. We're starting to hear a little bit more about the teams, but I think we hear even less about the individuals and like the individual women. And so I was just really interested to hear like why you think it's important as well that specific individuals also get the limelight as well as, I guess, the broader teams.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's a really, really good point. I think it's kind of easy just to be like, oh yeah, there was this team, and it's just quite kind of easy to do. I don't want to say lazy, because it's not lazy, and some of the work that's been put into uncovering and sharing about those teams are amazing. But I think it's when you like learn about the figures and again what they've gone through, or kind of the stereotypes that they had to break down, or the resistance that they faced, and how they overcame that. It is just so interesting and really inspiring. I think with Dick Kerr ladies, I agree, sometimes it can be a bit of a monolith where you're like, oh wow, that's that team that played in front of 40,000 people at Goodison Park. But then when you really get into learning about all the players, it's even more incredible. So again, I think it's just going back to they didn't get much credit at the time, and they were disparaged, and kind of people tried to stop them from doing what they loved. So I think it's just important that individually they also get that acknowledgement.
No, absolutely agree on that one. I want to bring it back to a football point of view, and I know there's a couple of questions for you in the chat as well, so I guess we will come back to those as well. We do see your comments and questions, and NT's made a good point as well about the little to no coverage, which I'm sure Laura will come back to in a second. But I just want to ask you from a broader sense, I guess, in terms of what her involvement was just within football. While we're on, I guess, the football channel, what was her involvement for people who maybe haven't read the book yet or haven't seen much about her involvement in football?
Yeah, so it was pretty incredible, really. When I was researching this, I was quite taken aback by kind of the level of organization. I think when you read about her, you realize she's a stickler for like organization and rules and stuff like that, which sometimes is to her detriment, but other times it means that the structure she builds and the level of kind of organization that's happening within women's sport. I think over here in England, women's football was more like there were these factory teams popping up. They were playing each other. There wasn't like necessarily a proper league or anything. It was kind of just, it just seemed like this big boom of popularity, but there wasn't particularly much organization on a broader sense. But in France, so there were these women's sports clubs, one of which Milliat was a president of, and then there were others as well. She got them together in a league, so they all had women's football teams, and it was the first structured women's football league in, I think, the world, but definitely in Europe. And they had like a proper season. They were having proper teams. They had proper cups. They had this. Initially, it was quite centered in Paris, but then they would go out and play matches in the countryside to try and get women in the countryside interested in set up their own teams. So then there was like a Paris Cup, and then there was a France Cup. So the organization was incredible, and it was, I think, it seemed like a real kind of special thing happening there. And then I think Alice was so ambitious as well that she didn't really see it as just limited to France, so she kind of wanted to expand it. So that's when she got in touch with Alfred Frankland, who is the Dick Kerr ladies manager, and they exchanged some letters and decided to do this tour of England and then the tour of France. So Alice got all the best players from all the different teams in France, and made this kind of super team, and that's the team that went and toured in England, and she was their chaperone, I guess. She kind of supervised them, and she was one of the only people in the group that could speak English, so I think she was also a bit of a translator as well. And yeah, the matches in England were really well attended. It's really nice reading. A lot of the information that I found about it was reading newspaper clippings and articles from the Times. and they would do kind of cultural exchanges. So they went to Blackpool for the day. When they were in London, because they got the train and the ferry into Dover, and then got the train to Victoria, so they'd go to the theatre. And it was just amazing kind of hearing firsthand accounts from them and their experiences of playing in England. And then a few months later the French team went and played over, the Dick Kerr ladies went and played over in France and had the same kind of thing. It was quite soon after the First World War as well, so they did a lot of visiting cemeteries and stuff like that. And it wasn't even necessarily limited to that, so there were more exhibition matches arranged in Spain and Portugal. So she just was really instrumental in basically creating a really good structure in France, where there was this proper league going for 10 years, and then also trying to expand it across Europe by essentially kind of taking these matches over to other countries and being like, this is what's possible. It's really, when I came across it, I was like, I can't actually believe the level of structure that was going on at that point. It was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, no, it certainly sounds remarkable. And I don't want to like go too much into the book, because obviously we want people to read it, etc. But obviously we kind of talk about that period of women's football in England as being like a boom during the war, because that was allowed with the men away. Was the parallels in terms of like the French reception and how was it received at the time? And then I guess, did it come to a conclusion, and what was that? How did that play out, as much as you kind of want to go into?
Yeah. So there were parallels. It was interesting because in France there wasn't the same level of the women taking jobs when the men went away. So I think the First World War in England and some other European countries was a real turning point for women's rights and women getting more autonomy. It wasn't as much in France, but it was still a way for, I guess, I think when Alice rose to power in French sport, or kind of rose up the ranks, I think it was within the backdrop of the First World War and men being away. Like, without the First World War, I'm not sure it would have happened. But the football side of it in England, they kind of used raising money for charities to do with the war, like veteran soldiers, as a excuse for playing. So like, we're playing these matches, and the tickets, all the money is going towards charity, basically. So that was the same in France. That's kind of how they justified doing it. And I think it did kind of follow a bit of a similar path. I think there wasn't quite the same level of interest, or people being like, oh, the thousands and thousands. I think even in France, maybe because of what happened in the First World War, there was kind of less of that women gaining autonomy in that period. It never seemed to take off quite as much, and I think there was more suspicion about it. And it's actually quite interesting because it ends, I don't want to give it away too much, but I think it's quite surprising how it ends. It's not necessarily the same as in England, where it was like the FA essentially put a stop to it by kind of banning women's football. There was a bit more of a surprising twist to it. So I'll let people read it and see. But I would say there was quite a similar timeline, where it was like the First World War was the catalyst. You had these 10, 15 years, which was a massive boom, and then it kind of really got pushed down a little bit.
It's really intrigued now to because I've not read the book. I'm really going off what you're saying here. I'm kind of like looking at it, going like, do I sneak a peek towards the end to find out what happened here? My kind of next question, it leads into a little bit into terms of what MT mentioned. Obviously, little or to no TV coverage, no internet to help promote her work, and so on. I just wanted to ask you in terms of like, how do you conduct research? For a book like this, that's obviously in and around 100 years ago for some parts of it as well. And you're looking at times like that where the coverage maybe wasn't there, particularly for women at that time. How do you find, all this information out about her and the stuff she did around, football and, the stuff about the Olympics and everything else?
Yeah, it was quite hard. I think this is the first English book on Alice, but there were 2 books in French. But as we were talking about before we started this, I can't actually speak French, which I think is another obstacle, because if I was fluent in French, I think it'd be easier to get that information. but there is a lot of academic work on her, so more like journal articles and kind of shorter pieces. So my starting point was those. There's 3 or 4 that are quite in depth, and there's an historian called Florence Carpentier, who's a bit of an expert. She's French, she's a bit of an expert on Alice. So I kind of started with those journals, and then within those, they have their own references, so I could kind of see where they'd got their information. So there was primary sources on the French side in the Olympic Study Centre, so the like Olympic Archive in Lausanne. So I did a study trip there and spent a few days in the archive. Then there were some minutes from the Women's Sport Federation that Alice set up, which were really useful. So thankfully, they were in an archive in Nice, and they could send me the documents. But they were in French, so I had to get them translated. But it was worth it because the insight was really good. So yeah, it was just a lot of like digging around. I found that the English side of it was a bit easier because there was a lot of stuff documented in the newspapers. So there's like the British Newspaper Archive or something like that. There was a lot of stuff in the newspapers when the French team came over, and when Dick Kerr ladies went over as well. They were really documenting those trips, and Alfred Franklin, who was Dick Kerr ladies manager, even when they went to France, was literally writing a little entry into I think it was like the Yorkshire Post or Huddersfield Post or something like that. So it was literally like a bit of a diary about what they were doing. So that was kind of the basis for it. And then there was a lot of wider material. So women, the history of women at the Olympics, the history of women in football, all of that I could kind of use as the context. And then it was just a bit of digging and going to archives and talking to people to find out the other stuff. I would say that also some of it is my interpretation. Like I think you get that in history. I did a history degree, so I that kind of came into use there, because some of it you just got to look at what you've got and be like, this is my interpretation of what happened. And it's clear in the book when it is. Like I wouldn't say it as facts, but I think sometimes you just have to fill in the gaps yourself a little bit. So yeah, there'll be times in the books where it's kind of like, this is essentially the information we have, and this is kind of what I think was most likely to happen. But yeah, it was quite tricky. I think the lack of French speaking. I said if I was to write another book, I'd definitely do one on someone English.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. It's really interesting what you kind of said in terms of like the English stuff being more available, because I guess that talks to the earlier point that you were making in the reception to the game, that perhaps there was more interest like in England rather than France. But yeah, no, so I definitely struggle with French. I was very, very nervous about saying the title. So going any further,
You said it really well, though. You said it really well. I was impressed.
My year 8 French coming in well. I guess, like, again, maybe not the most surprising thing, because we want to wait to read that in the book. But what like maybe like shocked you as part of your research that you maybe weren't expecting as part of this, either about Alice or just the wider context that you found out about the period?
Yeah, I think that the thing that I went into it with, I had this mindset that Alice was this perfect person, and I was also judging her by like today's standards of what you'd think would be like a good feminist or a good person that believes in women's rights. I realized quite quickly that was a bit unfair, because even though she is a hero, the work she did was incredible. She was still born in like 1884, and she still lived in the early 1900s. There was sometimes her behavior or the way she would react to things surprised me, because I think I had this mindset of, I live in 2024 and this is the way we would deal with things now, which I did kind of quickly realize was probably a bit unfair. I think you have to look at her actions in the context of the time. I think, yeah, when you read it, you'll kind of see what I mean a bit more by that. And then probably the other thing, there was a lot of, I guess, male allies as well. Like, I think it's quite easy to be like, oh, men hate women's sport. Like, they didn't want women to succeed during that time. But there were a lot of men that did really good stuff. And again, like, I don't think in that time period, Alice would have been successful. She didn't have really good male allies, and you can kind of see in the book how those male allies, when she has a lot of them, she's very successful, and when they kind of fall away, that's when she starts to lose her influence a little bit. So I was quite surprised by that, but then also it's kind of also quite telling that she needed them. Basically, she couldn't have done it fully by herself.
No, it's interesting to hear on that one, actually. Kieran, I just referenced you. So, Kieran's been putting a lot of great comments in the chat, by the way. And I'm intrigued, Kieran, if you appreciate Laura's French kind of pronunciation at the start as well. Sorry to put Laura on the spot, but whether you think, as soon as you are watching from France, what you thought on that one. Obviously, you touched on this a bit earlier on in the show about the Olympics, and I guess just what her involvement in that part of her history as well was around that time. You mentioned that it was called obviously something different as well, because obviously there was issue taken to it being called the Women's Olympics. How was she involved in all of those kinds of things without giving, again, too much away from the book as well?
Yeah, so her main drive, I think one of her main ambitions was to get women's athletics at the Olympics. So it wasn't added. The Olympics started in 1896. There was no women's athletics until 1928. So obviously quite a big period. So she campaigned for that. That was kind of one of her main driving points. And yeah, she definitely annoyed people at the International Olympic Committee a lot. And the Athletics Federation president as well. She got rejected a lot in the early days, so that's when she created her own event, which the name eventually changed. But she did succeed. I think, again, you kind of have to read it, but her success was a bit mixed. But she did ultimately get women's athletics on the Olympic program. Initially, it was quite limited, so there were only 5 events. So she was unhappy about that. She wasn't, kind of fully fulfilled. So the rest of her career when she was working was spent trying to increase that from 5 to a full program, I think of 12. So yeah, just it's a lot of her career was kind of spent campaigning and annoying people at the Olympic Committee. I think she was described as troublesome and persistent, and I just like that because I think that describes what she did perfectly. Really, she wasn't afraid to be annoying and just campaigned for that side of things. And yeah, well, she didn't get what she wanted, so she was like, right, I'm just going to do my own women's Olympics then.
Yeah, I feel like all good women in history must have been called troublesome and persistent.
Yeah,
badge of honor, surely, for women in history. I guess, like, we've probably spoken bits about it, but when people read this book, like, what do you want to be the key takeaway from it at the end?
Yeah, I think probably quite a few things. I think definitely just to be more aware of the history of women's sport, and I guess the work and the courage that people used to have to take to even, put women in the conversation, let alone let them even compete. So I think just maybe just a knowledge of Alice and a knowledge of women's sport in that time and women's football and all the campaigning that had to go on. And I like the troublesome and persistent thing. I think maybe just a bit of a what George just said. I think I think that is good to just have that as a motivation, because we all are in women's football, and sometimes you might have to have a bit of a difficult conversation. We're all kind of striving to promote women's football and women's sport coverage, and just having that in the back of our heads, having her determination and what she pushed to do, and hopefully we're already working in it, but maybe some other people will read it and be more inspired to promote women's sport as well. So yeah, kind of like, I guess 2 parts, like the history side of it is being more aware and being educated about the history, but then also inspiring all of us to do similar actions as Alice and promote women's sport.
No, absolutely agree on that one. I'm going to bring George's comment on screen for you, because I thought that definitely was a good one. And Kieran, don't we all, on that one? That's why we want to do more of these types of conversations, not just about the present in terms of what's going on, because as Nancy referenced at the start, there is a lot of current issues, but there is good referencing a long time ago as well, and looking at the past as well. My final kind of questions, I guess, is any challenges you found while writing it. But you mentioned obviously, that you couldn't, you're not fluent in Spanish, in French, so that might have been, you might be fluent in Spanish, I don't know, not fluent in
one language
in French, so that might have been a challenge as well. But I guess a secondary part to that, has this spurred you on to write maybe another one about somebody else in the future?
Yeah, I really loved it. I did really love it. I think actually that period I had towards the end of last year, I was fortunate enough to get a grant from the Royal Society of Authors, and they have a specific bit of funding for people writing about women, like a women's biography. So that was really great. So I was working part-time and then writing the book, and I absolutely loved it. I think there's just something about it. I think having that project for a period of time, something that I was really interested in, and just uncovering more and putting it together, like I thought it was really fun. I think it's been a bit more challenging, probably more at this end of it, where I've gone back to full-time work and just kind of the promotion and getting everything organized, because you put a lot of time into it. You want people to read it, and you want it to do well. So it's kind of like, just dedicating a bit of time to, I guess, like literally messaging Connor and being like, please, can I talk about it on the show? You got to do that like a lot. But yeah, I guess apart from that one big problem I had was the British Library, which is, I'm fortunate enough to live pretty close by. It's like amazing if you're doing research, because you just get your card and you can go into the reader's room and request loads of books and stuff like that, and all the newspapers. That's where I saw it. They had a massive cyber attack in like November, and they're still affected by it. So the library was completely closed for 2 months, which the 2 months of writing, which was a real struggle. And I managed to find a website where you can kind of access everything online, so that was okay. But yeah, I'm glad it didn't happen right at the start, because I probably would have been a bit screwed. So that was completely unexpected, and to be honest, just unfortunate. It wasn't really part of the writing process. It was just whoever hacked the British Library. That was quite annoying. But yeah, I think I would be tempted to write another one. I do have a potential idea, but I might wait a couple of years before doing it.
Yeah, no, well, I'm excited if you have another one, but excited to read this one after the conversation. I guess the key thing now is, where can people get a hold of the book?
Yeah, so I guess kind of all where you'd normally get your books. So Waterstones, yeah, this is it. This is the title. Waterstones, WH Smith's, Hive, Bookshop. It's a website which I think takes it from your local bookshop. So if you want to support local bookshops, I think it's bookshop.org, Amazon. And yeah, so if you search the title, Pitch publishers who publish it have like a site where they've got all the different websites you can buy it, or Waterstones, Amazon, WH Smith's. Yeah. If you look at my Twitter as well, I'm constantly sharing where to buy it as well.
Yeah, so definitely do go and look up all those good places. Hive is brilliant. That's like the ethical Amazon if you don't want to give money to Amazon. So definitely.
I know some people do, Amazon for ease, but I am aware that some people also don't like Amazon, so you don't have to get it from there if you don't want to.
Yeah, no, I do still do Amazon for ease, but where I can, I sometimes do Hive as well. Yeah. When I'm on Prime subscriptions, not on.
I know, yeah, that's what I use my mum's Prime, and it's just the next day delivery. Sorry.
There's only so much you can do. But yeah, no, absolutely. Go and buy the book, La Vie, Jamais, Racontée, if I said that right. And I'm sure all the links can be found on Nancy's socials if you do forget, and we can probably put them on the comments of this video as well afterwards. So thank you all for watching. Thank you, Nancy, for coming on. I've really enjoyed talking about it. I just want to go and read now. But yeah, we will see you. I'm sure we'll be back on Monday for another show. So keep an eye out for whatever that's about, and we will see you then.